Welcome everyone to another presentation on how to avoid food waste. Today's presentation is looking at how to avoid food waste when you have more space around you. So let's think about this concept of food waste and think about it. I'm going to challenge you in a little different way. I want you to see it as an asset. I want you to think about the benefits and the value you can get from your food scraps. Now, I'm not saying you deliberately have food scraps. So if you don't have them, that's the preference. If we think of the hierarchy tree, avoid, it would be the top of the hierarchy tree. So if we don't have them and you eat everything on your plate and we use all the scraps that might be broccoli stems and other things in your chook pile or in your scrap bucket, that's the best. But if you can't, and your table might look something like this when your household members leave it, where there's few scraps and bits and pieces on their plates, which is one type of our food scrap category, then I really want you to see it as an asset. Don't see it as a burden. See it as something that you can deliberately use to turn into other good, quite rewarding things. And most of those good, rewarding things are dirt, soil. Such a good benefit. So many things you can then turn around and grow out of that soil. So a lot of today's presentation is going to be about thinking of food waste. If you have to have it, let's think of it as being an asset. So again, I want to revisit some of the thoughts from some of the other presentations, just to keep that in your top of mind as different things happen through this one. And they are, why are we avoiding food waste? Like, why do we need to? Well, think about those little picture things. Think about how it saves you time, it saves you money, and is a chance that you'll eat healthier because you're thinking through what you're eating more. The little picture, the reasons why it relates to you. Okay, there are all those sorts of reasons, of really, really solid reasons for avoiding food waste. And then you've got the big picture, which is also about reducing or preventing food waste. And the big picture is about trying to make sure that we use our resources to the best degree, trying to make sure that those resources can then be reapplied and reused, trying to make sure our food system, which is currently not on the best legs, not the best system, very lineal based, has more of a cyclical nature to it, so that we experience that circular economy, or that thinking that applies to the circular economy. And therefore, just thinking big picture well-being for our planetary resources and making sure that what we do have, we use to its best devices. So keeping all that in mind as the presentation goes on today, have a think about how you can apply some of the things that we're going to do in your household. Okay, like any asset, you need to be able to manage it. So we've got a whole range of different types of food scraps or food waste in front of or behind me here. So let's look at how you might manage it. In the previous or another presentation, we certainly talked about containers, and hopefully you can see evidence of good containers. These are transparent, they have lids that go on them, a small enough volume that you don't get stinky waste. You know, because we don't want that to be a big bucket, and by the time it gets full, you have to, you know, hold a peg on your nose, so it's way too smelly. So a couple of common groups that I've got here that I'd like to share with you in terms of management options. Some of them are seen as problematic, but as we talked, you'll see that it's really just about management. In that regard, the first thing I'd like to encourage you to do is to actually separate your different waste into categories or groups. So you might have an end goal, and maybe it's composting, and part of that end goal means that's how you separate your waste. So traditionally, things like citrus and onion peels, avocado, some meat scraps are traditionally not incorporated into a compost environment, but I would encourage, and so therefore I would encourage you to containerize according to how you want to manage your waste at the end goal, whether it's composting or not. Might be some of the bokashi or some of the other strategies we've talked about before in other presentations. You may need to go back and revisit those. But if not, let's go forward and talk more composting. Okay, so managing food scraps. The first one might be onions. Now, you could think that it's not a very palatable item, the skin of an onion, but there's a couple of things to think about, and it's up to you how your household best works for these, but I'm just going to give you some ideas. So if you steam those, so let's say we've got this in a plastic container, completely microwavable, pop it in the microwave for a minute or so, maybe with leave a lid on. Just let it steam. What you'll find is that breaks down some of the oils and the acids that are in the onion, and it actually becomes way more compostable. So just give it a little cook up and then it composts quite well, so you can incorporate that more easily. But considering we're on that I'm not going to waste food, this also could be seen as a very good asset. So you might find that you're making, particularly at the moment, it's winter here and it's quite cold, stews, and you're making some meat dishes that might need marinating, then you can actually use the skins and the tailings, just give them a wash. In the stew, you might retrieve them, or it would be best to retrieve them out of the stew once you've cooked it, but it adds a lot of flavour, adds that whole onion flavour, and sometimes when you've got a red onion, you can get some really cool coloured variation in there too. Similarly, if any of you are into tie-dyeing, then these colours of the onion skins can be really useful. From my experience, they create like a purple and brown sort of effect in the tie-dyeing. They can dye your wools, your new fabrics as well. Way more people, way more experienced about doing that, but that could be another little hobby or asset you could see. So keep that particular group of food waste separate and make the most of it. Grabbing another bucket, so this one is my citrus bucket. So anytime we squeeze a lemon, we have our lemon and water in the mornings, or I love lemon in all sorts of things. So it could be slices or cakes or any sorts of context. Then the peels get the rind shaved off them, and also we then use the juice and the internal flesh. So there's not much left in this bucket, but the rind and the skates off the end of the pith are certainly there. Again, could be deemed as something that you don't put in the compost. So with lemon, you can actually, they've got a few options again for managing this huge asset. One of my favourite things to do with lemon halves or lemon skin, and I keep saying lemon, but this applies to citrus as a big group, is to actually soak it in some vinegar. And this is great, becomes a great, beautifully citrus scented cleaning product. So I use this in a spray bottle. I use it in the restaurant. I use it here in a spray bottle, just to put the vinegar and decant that in a spray bottle and squirt the benches, and you get that beautiful cleansing because of the acidic nature of the vinegar. And you also get the aroma of the citrus. So it takes that vinegar smell away. It doesn't smell like maybe a fish and chip shop or that wherever vinegar is well applied. So that's a great way to use your citrus. If that's not quite your thing, or if you want to still use the halves that after you've taken the vinegar off, another really good thing to do, and this is a bit more smelly, so I wouldn't do this in the kitchen, is to actually fill your bucket of citrus food waste with some water and leave that to steep outside. What happens again, similar to steaming the onion, is it breaks down, helps to start breaking down all those oils in the citrus, and so releases those. It becomes really mushy, and then you can either add it to your compost, but if you're still a little bit worried, you can dig a separate hole and just bury it in that way. Again, you can manage these food waste items really well simply because you're separating them out. It's a great technique. Eggshells. Eggshells are so cool. So many uses with eggshells, and some of them I mentioned in previous presentation, but let's just do a little revisit and a little review. So the eggshells I keep in the kitchen here, they don't have any odour to them. I keep them in the kitchen because I'm not sure how old this one is, it might not crunch up. They crunch up beautifully into little tiny pieces. And anyone who knows that surface area to volume ratio thing, the smaller the pieces, the more likely they are to break down. We also know that eggshells are really high in calcium. So if you have these beautiful crushed little pieces of eggshell and spread them around your garden, you're actually supplying calcium to the garden. Great thing, particularly in a cool climate environment where calcium is not translocated through a plant very easily. Perfect. It also has the added benefit of the membrane within the eggshell being quite a snail and slug deterrent. So they placed around little tempting carrot seedlings or anything else that snails and slugs tend to be predating upon will be quite a deterrent. But they only last for sort of 3 or 4 days until they get wet. And then that aroma must go and the snails and slugs maraudingly will attack still, so beware of that. So again, this is a big asset that we can use in lots of different ways, and I'm sure there's lots of other ways you can apply eggshells, but they're just a couple. This one here is a fantastic example of one of the products that is quite problematic, and that is leftover oil. A couple of things to think about. First of all, try and apply the oil on your feta dishes. So for example, if you're making a beautiful tart with feta in it, maybe cook some of the onion in some of the oil from the feta. If you're making a salad and you're crumbling feta over the top, maybe use a little bit extra oil as the dressing on the salad. So try and incorporate the oil into what you're doing, and that applies for most of the food products that you might have in oils. The oil can be used in small quantities in your cooking. And in fact, you can actually make a shandy with it too. So if you're worried, for example, you might have some oil off some sun-dried tomatoes, and yet you want to cook something that really you don't want to taste like sun-dried tomatoes, by all means, put just a couple of tablespoons of that oil in with perhaps a cup of what would be regular olive oil, and then you won't get that flavour transferred in abundance. So there's some good strategies for actually using it in the kitchen. If you have it and you're just really concerned that the oil's been sitting in your fridge or in the pantry for too long and you're really nervous about using it and you need to dispose of it, there's a couple of options you've got. First of all, you can actually soak if you've got some old crusts of bread as well, you can actually pour the oil onto the old bread and the bread will soak up that oil. That then makes it very compostable in small quantities. So you've got, if we're thinking about the science behind it, we've got the oil as being really high carbohydrate with some protein in the bread, and so that starts that process of breaking down. The Pakashi bucket that we've seen in other presentations, that will totally handle oil as well. So you can incorporate that and pour that into your Pakashi bucket. With a lot of these things, you need to be mindful there's a balance. All right, so you wouldn't fill the bucket with a lot of oil, and similarly with your compost, if you've got quite a few slices of bread soaked in oil, you wouldn't put a whole lot of them in the compost and nothing else. You need that diversity of ingredients. You need to make sure that all the little critters in your compost have got the opportunity to eat a wide range or consume and live in a wide range of different ingredients. So be mindful of balance in that way. Probably the least useful thing regarding oil is to incorporate it just generally, like pour it over your compostable food scraps. In that way, it means all of those compostable food scraps, some of them which are not high in protein, are not able to be decomposed by the other critters. So just be mindful if you've got, keep the breads or the old scraps of, or your scones that didn't, take, or whatever it might be, that's got that wheat-based element to it, and that will take up the oil and then makes it completely way more compostable. Okay, so we're really getting this picture that we divide things up and they become the asset. Just in the last bit I've got here, so I've got some scraps from the restaurant, and I've also got some home-based scraps as well. So we're going to take those with us down to build a compost heap so that you can get a perspective on how we can really acetize, and I'm sure that's not a word, all of our food scraps. So here we are with compost. Super exciting product or material to work with, and it's all come from organic materials, some of which have been food waste, which let's have a little explore and smell. So it hasn't got an aroma, it has got evidence of some of the eggshells still in here, and it has immense growing potential, particularly when incorporated with your natural soil. It has lots and lots of critters, bacteria and fungi in here, breaking down that organic material, releasing those nutrients, and coupling in with any plants that you put to grow in here. They connect themselves to the root systems of your plants, and they help move that nutrition from the compost and the soil material into your plant itself. It again is a fantastic product to have in your garden. Water retention, I could go on forever, but let's have a look at how we can actually build a compost heap. One of the strategies at least, and some of the things to think about why we should make more compost. Okay, so let's have a go at building a compost heap using some of the products we looked at earlier from the food waste. I think though we just need to talk about a few things before we get into the nitty-gritty of compost heap building. And some of them you might see in front of you and might already have questions. So these bays behind me and beside me are all my compost bays. So each month I try and build a new compost bay, and those compost bays therefore are at all different stages in their life cycles. I have them sited in this location because in winter they are under the trees, and it enables me to manage the moisture content. Living in southwest Victoria, we get quite a high rainfall on the edge of the Otways here, which means it can get really too wet and damp for some of the little critters that we need to be active in the compost. So having them under the canopy of trees is really useful. In summer, however, outside of the canopy of the trees is way more preferable. And again, in that instance, I may actually need to add water to the compost to help them actually get to that moisture level that we need. So siting a compost is really important. I would encourage you to think about the season that you're endeavouring to compost. I would encourage you to think about the medium on which you're putting your compost, and in fact the surrounds. So you can see I've got square bales as the outside parameter of or outside boundary of this compost. I find that really useful because it keeps the compost insulated in terms of moisture and a little bit of warmth. And the great thing is, being organic, I can just whip the strings off and I can use this deteriorating bale in another compost heap, which is, really good repurposing. So we've got our site sorted. We've decided this is the style of compost we're creating, and I'll talk about some other styles, but we'll start with this one, which is an above ground compost. It needs to be approximately 1 cubic metre in volume to enable enough warmth to develop within the compost. And that warmth is generated by the critters and all the activity they metabolize as they're breaking down the nitrogen and the carbon components of the organic materials that we're putting in here. To be able to make sure that compost doesn't have pathogens in it, we need to make sure the moisture content is also adequate, which is something I mentioned as well. In terms of ingredients, let's look at the ingredients we have for our compost. Let's break them into categories because it's really important that we understand whether they're a high carbon ingredient or whether they're a high nitrogen ingredient. So let's have a look. In the wheelbarrow here, I have some of the beautifully provided manure and bedding from the chooks behind me. So that's quite high in both nitrogen and carbon. I've got some sawdust, which is carbon, some wood ash, which is more carbon, definitely no nitrogen. It's a little problematic, so I'd encourage you to use that sparingly. Same with some coffee grounds. I've got some sawdust, some really, really fine sawdust. Again, high in carbon. This is great. I love this as an ingredient. So this is leaf mold or leaf litter. So it's really been sitting under the trees for a while, starting to break down. It's really high in fungi and it provides great humus, which is actually a fantastic little habitat for the fungi to live in. I've got some of the paper from the restaurant. So what we do at the restaurant is we manage all of our organic materials. So we keep our receipts and dockets and any used serviettes separate. So I use those all in the compost. I wanted to show you this one because I love this. I actually used some of the paper from the compost, from the restaurant. And before I put it in the compost, I spread it out over the lawn and then I mow it. Yes, I mow it. So what it does is you can see this one is now incorporated with some of the green leafy material from the lawn, which means that I, in this box, have both lawn, nitrogen, paper, carbon. A fantastic way of starting that decomposition process. I have some blood and bone. I have our food scraps from where we were in the kitchen earlier. So they're the food scraps that haven't been into the chook pen. And I have some food scraps behind that that are a bit smelly. And they have actually been in the chook pen. So my traditional habit is to get the scraps from the restaurant and then I have a little bay where the chooks get to forage and scratch through the scraps. Then once they're all been through, taken what they like out of it, I collect those up again. They're a bit muddy and a bit smelly and they get incorporated into the compost as well. So they're high in nitrogen. Behind that, we've got some of our eggshells and we've got something else. We have some comfrey. And comfrey is a fantastic starter for a compost. It's high in nitrogen, well, not super high, it's sort of in the moderate scale, but it's more nitrogenous than it is carbon based. And it actually has silicates in it. The silicates are really, really good at starting to break down a lot of those nutrients and help that process from the critter's perspective. So they're really useful for that. So the golden rule, once you've got all your ingredients together, the golden rule, if there was only one, is to make sure that you have 25% nitrogen in relation to 75% carbon. So that's why we've got way more carbon-based ingredients to our compost making today. And then, to start with, it's a matter of making like a lasagna. So let's put them down, shall we? Let's start. I think we'll start with something that's both a mix of nitrogen and a mix of carbon. So this is the chook bedding. And the chook bedding has just simply been taken out of the chook house, so it's got manure and it's got some hay, it's got a few seeds in it as well. So that's both carbon and nitrogen. Let's add some carbon to that. So maybe some of our leaf mold. Now it must be time to put some more nitrogen. Let's put some comfrey. And again, one of our other combos. So mix up some of that. That's the combo that was the lawn mowing clippings. Oh, I love that. It's so much fun to make too. And let's go some blood and bone on top of that. Just to sprinkle. Little rodents really love blood and bone. So if you put any lumps in there, I'm sure they will find them. Now we've got, let's put some of the sawdust down because that's quite high in carbon. And I'm going to put food scraps on top of that, which are really high in nitrogen. So let's put those out. They're the ones that have been all picked through by the chooks. And then we're going to top that high nitrogen with some carbon. So you can see what we're doing. We're sort of building up these layers, and it's good to break this down into small pieces. We're building up these layers in relation to the content of nitrogen or carbon that they have in them. We'll put some more comfrey. So you can see why I referred to it as lasagna before. Some of our eggshells, so not carbon, but a bit of calcium. Crunch those up, so we've got our surface area happening. Now let's do a little bit of wood ash. Not too much, because that changes the pH, and the critters don't really like the pH being too far in the alkaline community. Let's put some more chook bedding. And one more thing that I need to think about is the moisture content of the ingredients that we're putting on here. So I've got some water sitting here so that we can actually dampen that down, but I won't do that until we put the paper on. So let's put our other bucket of scraps that have been through the chooks. At this point, I'm sure you're really pleased you don't have smell-o-vision, because they're not the best odour, as others who are here can testify to. All right, some paper, which is really high in carbon and quite dry. Because it's so dry and we need to make sure our moisture levels are nice and high, let's add some water to that. And you may need to dampen, in this environment, you may need to dampen that down again because we're underneath the trees. A little bit of sawdust, very fine sawdust. Let's top it off now with some more leaf litter. And another little bit of carbon, high carbon material, some more hay, broken down nicely. There we go. So that covered over with a cloth that will keep the moisture content in there in summer, or a weed mat in winter so that it has more access to rain or not, will keep that all brewing over a period of the next 3 months, maybe less, 3 months definitely in winter. That will all break down and become this beautiful growing medium like we were looking at before. So all those base ingredients are what we saw before, with a few months of grace. So you could see them all decomposed and breaking down, and all the great critters and everything were in there working at it for you. There are other styles of composting. As I mentioned, this is an above the ground one, but you can also just simply make a really limited compost on top of the ground in your veggie garden. Make it 2 or 3 layers thick, use just basic organic materials and compost in situ. Or you could dig a hole and build a compost heap in the hole, again, in situ. So there's all different types of composting that you can find will work for you. And that's what it's really important to see. All of these organic materials I had access to, you may not have access to those, but you may have access to 2 or 3 of them. Well, use what you've got. Use that to its best device, and use those food scraps to help provide the nitrogen component in your compost heap. Huge benefit in making compost for all the plants that are in your garden. Vermi-composting, by any other name, is farming worms. So here we are at Annie and Phil's place in Port Campbell, looking at all the different strategies that Annie's applied to deal with some of the restaurant organics that they get in terms of food waste. One of the worm farms is behind me here, and we'll have a spy in this. But first of all, I need to encourage you to think like a worm. I want you to put your little I am a worm hat on. I want you to think this is really dealing with food waste in terms of farming. So those little worms, you need to think about what they need from you in terms of food and habitat and moisture levels. So thinking that through, you need to make sure that you understand what type of worm that you have. So when we have a look in this worm farm here, we'll see, if we're quick before they disappear, we will see some tiger worms. So these little tiger worms have got the lines and the stripes on them. They are voracious eaters in this worm farm, which means they can cope with high nitrogen food, which is the organic food scraps that you get. That high nitrogen food they love. Still keeping all that in mind though, you still need to think about the other types of worms that you have. So for example, if you collect worms from your garden, they probably won't be tiger worms. They will be less likely to like food waste, and so you may need to feed them less and different things. So again, think like a worm. Think about what your worm types are and think about what they might need from you. If you have got tiger worms, I want to encourage you to think about not feeding them too regularly. You want to make sure that their food is almost all gone before you put any more food in there. And when I say food, it's the food scraps that we talked about earlier, avoiding some of those things that we also mentioned in other presentations like onions and citrus, some avocado, avoiding those sorts of food scraps from the worms. They won't really like them, so it's best to leave them out. However, the rest of the food scraps can go in there, and if you want to chop them all up and munch them all up, the worms will love you for it. So again, managing a worm farm is really about farming. You need to put your worm hat on, think like a worm, behave like a worm when you're dealing with them. Don't feed them too much, keep it damp, not letting it get dry. Site your worm farm in a place that is reasonably warm in the mornings and cooler in the afternoons, not in full sun at any point of the day. That will be most beneficial to you. The other very important benefit that you get as a result of worm farming, which is one of the ways of turning our food waste into an asset, I've mentioned that to you guys before, and that is that beautiful product called worm castings, which you'll find in the lower part of the worm farm. So those worm castings are those beautiful, rich, spongy, very high in retaining moisture, organic humus. And we get, in the bucket down here, we get worm tea, which is the liquid that you would then dilute and put onto your garden, particularly onto your very quick growing vegetable garden species and selections. They will again love that worm tea. Lots of benefits from vermicomposting. The secret though, think like a worm. Happy to answer questions, but by all means, think about Googling some other resources that might help you. And I'd like just at this point to thank everyone who's been involved with the project. Thank you for coming with us on the journey and through all the different presentations. I hope you've learnt some bits and pieces that you can apply. I hope your food waste went from that to that, or maybe that. And I also would like to thank all the sponsors who participated in funding this project. Thank you everybody, and go forth and make sure that your food waste is minimised.